The man who had sold her the canyon claim came back in February. He came on horseback, which was a thing that required specific determination in a Colorado February, and he came from the west, which was the direction of the settlement at Breckenridge Creek, where he kept his land office and his ledgers, and the careful records of every transaction he had conducted in the territory since 1859. His name was Aldous Fenn. He was 44 years old, and he had been selling land in Colorado since before most of the people he sold it to had heard of Colorado, and he had a reliable instinct for the difference between land that was worth what he said it was worth and land that was not. He had told Ragna that the canyon claim was worth $40 in the spring of 1862. He had told her this with a clear conscience, because $40 was the standard rate for a quarter section in the territory, and the canyon claim was a quarter section and therefore worth $40 by the standard arithmetic. Whether the canyon claim was worth $40 to live on, to build on, to survive a Colorado winter on, was a different question that the standard arithmetic did not address. He had thought about this question as she was riding away from his office in May. He had thought about it and concluded that it was not precisely his problem, that she had asked to see what he had available, and he had shown her what he had available, and she had chosen the canyon claim because she said it was sheltered from the wind, which was true, and he had sold it to her for $40 and recorded the transaction and filed the deed and moved on. He had thought about it again in November, when the first serious cold came down from the high country, and he had looked at the map on his wall where the canyon claim was marked, and had thought, "She will come back." She had not come back. He had thought about it in December, when the temperature at Breckenridge Creek dropped to -14, and his own cabin, which was a proper frame cabin with a good stone chimney and adequate insulation and a wood supply he had laid in, with the specific care of a man who had survived 2 Colorado winters and intended to survive more, had been cold in the mornings before the fire was built up. She had not come back in December either. He had thought about her in January and had not done anything about what he was thinking, because he was a man who completed his obligations and then attended to his own affairs, and his obligation to Ragna had been completed when he handed her the deed in May. What happened after was her affair. In February, he rode to the canyon claim because he could not stop thinking about it. He told himself he was checking on an investment which was not entirely false, since his reputation as a land agent depended partly on the outcomes of the claims he sold, and a claim that produced a dead Scandinavian woman in the spring was not good for his reputation. He told himself this was a professional visit. He rode up the approach to the canyon in February light, and the approach was, as he remembered it, the narrow draw running east-west between 2 granite walls, the creek frozen in the bottom, the walls rising 30 feet on either side and cutting the wind to nearly nothing. He had always known the canyon was sheltered. That was not the question. The question had been whether sheltered was enough, whether the thermal protection of the granite walls was adequate compensation for the dark and the narrow, and the specific challenge of building in a slot canyon, where every dimension was constrained by what the rock permitted. He came around the last bend in the draw and stopped his horse. The cabin was there. It was exactly where she had said she would build it, flush against the south granite face on the north side of the canyon, its north wall the rock face itself, its south face open to the canyon with 2 windows catching whatever winter light came down the slot. It was a proper structure, not a desperation shelter, with a real roof of timber and sod and a chimney pipe rising from the south face, and a door that had been fitted with care. The chimney was cold. He looked at the chimney for a long time. No smoke, no heat shimmer above the pipe, no indication that a fire had burned recently. He dismounted. He knocked on the door, and then, when nothing happened, he looked at the snow around the door and looked at the tracks, which were recent and which went not away from the cabin, but around the corner of it, toward the back where the cabin met the north granite face. He followed the tracks. Around the back of the cabin, where the frame structure ended and the rock face began, there was a low opening in the granite. Not a door. A passage, perhaps 3 feet high and 4 feet wide, cut or worn into the face at ground level. Recent excavation around the edges, the granite chips still showing pale where they had been worked. He could see lamplight through the passage. He crouched and went through. He straightened up inside a space he had not imagined from outside. Not a room, not a cave in the dramatic sense, but a long horizontal pocket in the granite, running roughly parallel to the canyon wall, 10 feet wide and perhaps 30 feet deep, with a ceiling that varied from 6 feet at the passage entrance to 8 feet in the middle before coming back down. The granite walls were warm, not radiant, not fireplace warm. Warm the way stone was warm when it had been absorbing heat for a long time. A deep, steady warmth that came from everywhere and nowhere. A woman was sitting at a wooden table, reading a book by lamplight. She looked up at Aldous Fenn. She looked at him for a moment without speaking, the specific look of a person who had expected to be alone and had made their peace with being alone and was now required to revise that arrangement. She said, "Mr. Fenn." He said, "Mrs. Sørensdatter." He looked at the granite walls. He looked at the lamp and the table and the chair and the shelf of books and the sleeping platform and the iron stove that had clearly not been lit today. He pressed his hand against the nearest granite wall. The wall was 61 degrees. He held his hand there and looked at her. She said, "Sit down. I'll make coffee." She stood and moved to the small brazier in the corner, not the iron stove. A smaller stone-lined basin that held a modest fire of coals, barely the size of a hat, warming the coffee pot suspended above it on an iron rod. The fire was small. It was small in the specific way that fires were small when they did not need to be large. He sat down at her table and looked at his hand and at the granite wall and thought about the deed he had filed in May, and the $40 and the professional obligation he had discharged and the question he had been turning over since November. He said, "How long since you started the stove?" She said, 3 days. He said nothing. She said, "The rock doesn't need the stove." She said it simply, the way she said most things, in the direct manner of a woman who had grown up speaking Danish and had learned English as a practical tool for navigating a country where Danish was not useful, and who had never fully absorbed the English habit of saying things sideways. She said, "I start the stove when I want to cook something that requires sustained heat. For warmth, the rock is sufficient." He said, 60 degrees in February. She said, 61 this morning. It was 58 in November. It has been gaining since then. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I sold you this claim." She said, "Yes." He said, "I sold it to you because you asked for something sheltered, and it was the most sheltered claim I had." He paused. "I did not tell you about the granite." She looked at him. He said, "I knew the canyon walls were granite. I did not know what that meant for temperature. I assumed shelter from wind was the primary value." He paused again. "I was not accounting for the stone." She said, "No, most people don't." He said, "How did you know?" She said, "I didn't know. I suspected." She poured the coffee and brought it to the table and sat down. She said, "I grew up in Denmark. My father's farm was against a granite hillside in Jutland. He built the barn against the rock face. The barn was always warmer than any frame structure on the property. He thought it was the animals. I thought it was the rock." She paused. "I thought about it for 30 years before I had a chance to test it." He said, "And Colorado was the test." She said, "Colorado was the test." He looked around the granite pocket, the warm walls, the small fire sufficient for a February morning that was 21 degrees outside the canyon. He said, "The canyon itself, the slot between the walls." She said, "Yes, that too." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "Do you want to understand it?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Then I will explain what I found, not what I planned, because the planning was incomplete. What I actually found when I built here." This is what she told him. Ragna was 47 years old, and she had been a schoolteacher in the small Danish coastal town of Esbjerg for 19 years, before her husband Henrik died. And the particular geometry of a schoolteacher's life in a small town became untenable in the specific way that a widowed woman's position in a small community became untenable when the community had known her in a different condition and did not know quite what to do with the revision. She had come to America in 1860 with a trunk of books and the money from the sale of Henrik's furniture-making workshop and the specific intention of a woman who had spent 19 years teaching the children of other people and who was now, at 46, free to teach herself whatever she chose. What she chose was Colorado, not for its gold, which she had no interest in, for its land, which in 1860 was still being claimed and deeded and settled at rates that made it accessible to a woman with furniture money and no backing. She had read about the territory in a Danish periodical that came through Esbjerg with the shipping news, an account written by a Scandinavian emigrant with the specific enthusiasm of a person who wanted to convince other Scandinavians to follow him. And she had looked at the account's description of the mountain terrain and the granite formations, and she had thought about her father's barn for the first time in years. She spent her first winter in Denver learning English and reading everything available about the Colorado Territory's land, climate, geology. She was a teacher, and reading everything available was her professional method applied to a new subject. She read about the granite formations that underlaid the central mountains. She read about the temperature inversions in the high valleys. She read about the wind patterns and the snowfall rates and the creek drainage systems. She arrived at the Breckenridge Creek settlement in May of 1862 with a clear idea of what she was looking for and a vocabulary for asking about it that Aldous Fenn had not expected from a Danish woman of 47 asking to see available land. She had told him, "I want something sheltered with granite walls if possible, facing roughly east-west so the canyon runs with the sunrise." He had looked at her. He had said, "Most people want bottomland along the creek." She had said, "I know." "What else do you have?" He had shown her the canyon claim, which no one had taken because the canyon was narrow and the bottomland was minimal, and the practical difficulties of farming in a slot canyon were obvious to anyone who thought about farming. He had shown it to her without expectation, and she had stood at the canyon entrance and looked up at the 30-foot granite walls and the east-west orientation and the way the walls cut the wind, and she had said, "Yes." He had said, "The bottomland is," she had said, "this one." She had paid the $40 and taken the deed and ridden to the canyon. The first week in the canyon she did not build anything. She observed. She had learned this from teaching. You did not begin a lesson before you understood what the students already knew, because the lesson that ignored what was already present wasted everyone's time. The canyon was what it was before she arrived, and she needed to understand what it was before she could understand what she was adding to it. She slept in a canvas shelter the first week and watched. The canyon was east-west oriented, as she had asked, which meant the east granite face received morning sun and the west granite face received afternoon sun, and the light moved across the canyon floor from east to west through the day, touching both walls in sequence, each wall absorbing its solar allocation before the sun moved on. The walls were 30 feet high, and the canyon was perhaps 40 feet wide at its widest point, narrowing to 25 where she had decided to build. At the narrow point, the walls were close enough together that the sun reached both faces on the same day from the same low winter arc, the morning hitting the east face and the afternoon the west. She spent 3 days watching where the sun fell in May, doing the calculation in her head about what the December sun would do at its lower angle. In December, the sun in Colorado sat at roughly 26 degrees above the horizon at its highest. At that angle, entering a canyon 40 feet wide between walls 30 feet high, the sun would illuminate the canyon floor and the lower portions of both walls for perhaps 4 hours on a clear day. 4 hours of direct December sun on granite. She had no instrument for measuring what that meant in degrees. She had her hand, which she pressed against both walls at different times of day and in different positions, building the empirical catalogue that was her version of scientific measurement. The east wall in the morning, cold at sunrise, warming through the morning, warm by 10. The west wall, cool in the morning, warming through the afternoon, warm by 2. Both walls warm in the late afternoon, both walls giving back their accumulated warmth through the night. On the 4th day, she pressed her hand against the east wall at 4 in the morning. The wall was warmer than the air, not dramatically warmer, but the air at 4 in the morning in late May was 42 degrees, the cold pooling in the canyon bottom after the clear night's radiational cooling, and the wall was 48, 6 degrees warmer than the air at 4 in the morning after a full night of cooling. She sat with her back against the east wall at 4 in the morning and felt the warmth coming through her coat and thought about her father's barn in Jutland, the way the cattle had always clustered against the granite wall on cold nights, the way her father had assumed it was shelter from the wind, and she had always wondered if it was something else. It was something else. On the 5th day, she walked the canyon with a specific purpose, finding the location for the cabin. The standard logic of cabin placement in a narrow canyon would have been to center the structure in the available space, leaving room on both sides for access and for the roof eave to shed snow without the eave touching the walls. The standard logic was the logic of a builder who thought of the walls as obstacles. She was thinking of the walls as assets. She placed the cabin against the north granite face, against it, not near it. The north wall of the cabin was the north granite face of the canyon, the full 30-foot granite wall that had been absorbing and releasing heat since before the canyon was a canyon. She would not build a north wall. The mountain was her north wall. The cabin's south face would be open to the canyon with its windows and door, receiving the light that the canyon admitted and the warmth that reflected off the south granite face across the way. The south granite face was the secondary heater. Morning and afternoon sun hit it directly, warming its surface, and that surface radiated warmth back across the 40-foot canyon gap toward the cabin's south face, adding ambient warmth to what the cabin received from the north granite wall behind it. The cabin would sit between 2 radiators. She built the cabin in June and July with the help of 2 men she hired from the Breckenridge Creek settlement, Anders Lund and his son Petter, a Swede, and his son who had been in Colorado since 1860 and who built with the competence of men who had been building in cold climates since before Colorado was an option. She told them what she wanted. They looked at the north granite face and then at her. Anders said, "You want the cabin against the rock." She said, "Touching the rock. The north wall of the cabin is the rock face." Petter said, "The rock will be cold in winter." She said, "The rock will be 50 degrees in winter. That is not cold by the measure of what is outside." Anders looked at the granite face. He pressed his hand against it. He held it there. He said to his son in Swedish something she did not understand, and his son pressed his hand against the rock and said something back. She waited. Anders said, "It is warm." She said, "Yes, in May. In December it will be cooler, but it will never be as cold as the outside air. The rock is the hill. The hill has its own temperature." Anders looked at the canyon walls and then at the orientation, east-west, and at the southern exposure of the facing wall. He said, "The canyon is a stove." She said, "The canyon is a stove, yes. That is very close to correct." He smiled. He said, "We will build it your way." They built it her way. The north wall was the granite face, with the timber framing anchored directly into cracks in the rock, using iron pins she had brought for the purpose. The pins set in clay mortar that she packed into the cracks and let cure for a week before accepting weight. The frame was anchored to the living granite. The cabin would not shift or settle independently of the rock, because it was part of the rock. The east and west walls were standard timber framing, well chinked. The south face was the face she put the most work into. 2 windows, each 2 feet by 3, positioned to capture the winter sun at its low angle. The lower edges of the windows at the height that the December sun would enter at 26 degrees, calculated with the same geometry she'd been using since the first week. The door between the windows hung on iron hinges, fitted tight. The roof was low-pitched timber with 18 inches of sod above. The sod served as insulation above, reducing the heat loss through the roof that defeated many otherwise well-built structures in the mountains. She had read about sod roof insulation in the accounts of the Norwegian settlers in Minnesota and had decided it was applicable to Colorado granite. Anders had looked at the sod specification and said, "Heavy." She had said, "I know. Build the roof timbers for the weight." He had said, "It will be fine." He had smiled. Norwegian roofs are heavier. The cabin was 12 feet by 16 feet of interior space, small by some standards and adequate by hers, which were the standards of a woman who had lived in 3 rooms in Esbjerg and who understood that warmth was more important than size, and that a small warm room was better than a large cold one by every measure she cared about. She moved in on the 15th of August, 2 weeks before the first cold came down from the high country. The granite north wall, at the end of a Colorado August, was 64 degrees when she pressed her palm to it inside the cabin. The same wall outside was warmer than that from direct afternoon sun. She had not built through the wall. She had insulated the junction between the timber framing and the granite face with packed clay and wool fiber that Anders had suggested, the kind of junction insulation that the Scandinavians had been using since before the Viking Age, because the cold did not care about gaps, and neither did they. Inside the junction, the granite face was the cabin's north wall, sealed from drafts, continuous with the mass of the hill behind it, maintaining its 64 degrees without reference to what the August sun was doing or what the January wind intended. She pressed her palm to the north wall every morning and evening from August through November, building the catalogue. August, 64 degrees. September, 62. The first cold came in, and the rock surface lost 2 degrees. October, 60 degrees, stabilizing. November, 58. Stabilizing faster now as the cold consolidated. She was not surprised by the cooling. She had expected it. The question was how far it would cool, and at what rate, and the rate was slower than she had hoped, and slower than the outside temperature drop, which was the important comparison. While the outside temperature in November dropped from 45 to 20 degrees, the north wall dropped from 60 to 58. The wall was decoupling from the outside temperature. The mass was large enough, the coupling deep enough into the hill, that the winter was only reaching the surface of the hill's thermal reserve. She built fires in October, not because the cabin was cold, but because the fire served 2 purposes: warmth for the body, which was the immediate purpose, and heat added to the north granite wall, which was the strategic purpose. Each fire she built put heat into the cabin that the granite wall absorbed. The wall was not just giving, it was receiving and storing. She had been charging the battery since August. The first serious cold came on the 3rd of November. She woke at 3 in the morning to the sound the canyon made when the temperature dropped sharply, a settling sound from the granite, the thermal contraction of 30 feet of rock adjusting to the cold air coming off the high country. The canyon had a voice. She had been learning it since August. She lay in the cabin and listened to the canyon settle and pressed her hand to the north wall in the dark. 57 degrees. The wall had lost 1 degree overnight, Outside, by her estimate, it was below zero. The fire in the iron stove had been banked since 10 and was coals now, providing minimal heat. The cabin temperature by feel was 55. She got up and built up the fire to a moderate burn. Not large, not the panic fire of someone burning through their supply because they were cold and frightened. She built the fire with the deliberateness of someone who understood what the fire was doing, which was closing the remaining gap between the wall temperature and the comfortable temperature, a gap of 8 or 10 degrees, which was a gap that a modest fire could close and maintain. The firewood supply was 4 cord, stacked in the narrow space between the east cabin wall and the east canyon face, under a pole roof of her own construction that she had built as the first structure on the claim, the cover for the wood that preceded the cover for herself. 4 cord of Colorado fir and spruce, well seasoned, the best available from the settlement woodcutters. 4 cord for a Colorado winter. The standard advice at the Breckenridge Creek settlement was 8 cord for a frame cabin, 10 for a hard year. She had 4. She had bought 4 deliberately, not because she could not afford more, but because she was testing a hypothesis, and the test required that the supply be limited to what the hypothesis predicted would be sufficient. If the hypothesis was wrong, she would be cold, or she would be dead. She was a schoolteacher, and she had been testing hypotheses for 30 years, and she was careful with her hypotheses, and she believed this one. She burned the morning fire for 2 hours and then let it down to a maintenance level, a fire that was barely more than a sustained coal, sufficient to keep the cabin at 60 and to continue the slow process of adding heat to the north granite wall. The wall absorbed what the fire gave it and held it. She had observed this since August. The wall did not immediately equilibrate with the cabin temperature. It was slow to heat and slow to cool, which was the fundamental property that made it useful. A fast stone was no good. She wanted slow stone, stone that required days to move a single degree. The canyon gave her the slowest stone she had ever encountered. She developed a practice in November that became the daily structure of her winter. Press the palm to the north wall at waking, record the temperature by feel, add it to the catalog. Build the appropriate fire for the gap between the wall temperature and the target temperature, 65. Let the fire down to maintenance when the target was achieved. Press the palm again at midday, record. Press again at evening before the night fire. Build the night fire to a size calibrated to charge the wall for the overnight, more than the maintenance fire, less than a full burn. Each fire was a calculation. Each calculation was informed by the morning reading. The morning reading told her what the wall had given back in the night and what it still held, and therefore how much fuel the day required. She was, in effect, reading the stone's account book each morning. The stone had taken a deposit and was spending it slowly, and she was tracking the balance. In the second week of November, Anders Lund came from the settlement to check on her, which she had expected because Anders had the quality of a man who followed up. He came into the cabin and looked at the iron stove, which was burning at its maintenance level, small and steady, and looked at the north wall, and pressed his hand to it with the familiarity of someone who had been thinking about it since he helped build it. He said, 58. She said, 57 this morning. It's been building through the day. He said, outside it's 12. She said, yes. He was quiet. He looked at the cabin interior, the books on the shelf, the writing table, the lamp. The south window showing the afternoon light coming off the South Canyon face, the warm, cream-colored granite wall 40 feet away, reflecting the late sun back into the cabin, a secondary heat source she had not mentioned to him when they were building. He said, the south wall. She said, yes, the south granite face reflects warmth into the cabin through the south windows. In the afternoon, on clear days, it's equivalent to a moderate fire. She paused. I had not fully calculated that when I chose the site. It was a consequence of the orientation. He said, you chose the orientation for the morning sun. She said, I chose it for the east-west canyon axis. The reflected warmth from the south face is a bonus the geometry provides. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You could have told me this when we were building." She said, "I could have, but you would have thought I was speculating." He said, "I am thinking about my own cabin." She said, "Your cabin faces north." He said, "Yes." She said, "You are losing heat through the north wall continuously. There is nothing on the other side of your north wall but the cold." He said, "I know." She said, "If you backed your north wall to a rock face." He said, "There is no rock face near my claim." She said, "Then the east wall. If the east wall had a rock backing, you would have a thermal mass that receives morning sun on its outside face and radiates the absorbed heat through your east wall all afternoon and evening." He was quiet. He said, "How much rock would I need?" She said, "As much as you can get. The more mass, the longer it holds. A 10-foot face is better than a 5-foot face. A 20-foot face is better than 10. She paused. "But even a well-placed granite boulder, if it is large enough and if you build against it correctly, will help." He looked at his hands. He said, "Petter's claim has a granite outcrop on the south side. He does not use it." She said, "I know Petter's claim. The outcrop faces east. If he built against the east-facing face and ran his south wall along the outcrop's south surface, he would have two thermal mass walls at once." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How did you know about this?" "Before you came here," she said, "my father's barn in Denmark. It was built against a granite hillside, and it was always warmer than the other buildings." She paused. He thought it was the animals. I thought it was the rock. I had 30 years to think about it before I could test it. He said, 30 years is a long time to think about a barn. She said, "I was a school teacher. Thinking about things was my professional method." He said nothing for a moment. Then he smiled. He said, "My wife would like to meet you." She said, "Bring her in the spring. Tell her to come when the canyon walls are warm in the morning. I want her to press her hand against the east face at first light and feel the warmth the night left in it." December came. The settlement sent Aldous Fenn a note through the winter courier that ran between Breckenridge Creek and the mountain claims, a note that said only, "The canyon claim is inhabited and warm," signed with a name he did not recognize as the courier, and which was therefore, he concluded, Anders Lund's way of telling him that the Scandinavian woman he had sold the canyon claim to in May had survived the November cold and was expected to survive December. He filed this information and went back to his ledgers and thought about the canyon claim and what it had been worth versus what he had told her it was worth, and what the difference between those numbers meant for how he conducted his business. He had sold land for 3 years based on the standard assessments: bottomland, water access, timber supply, wind exposure. He had never sold land based on thermal mass. It had not been a category in his assessment. It was a category now. He added it to his ledger in the margin of the standard assessment form, a handwritten note in the narrow space between wind exposure and timber supply, granite proximity and orientation. He thought about this addition for the rest of December and did not act on it because December was not the time for acting on things in Colorado. December was the time for getting through December. He got through December. He thought about the canyon claim in January as the temperature at Breckenridge Creek dropped to -22, and his own well-built frame cabin with its good stone chimney and adequate insulation and 8 cord of firewood held 50 degrees in the mornings before the fire was built up, 50 degrees with 8 cord. He thought about a woman in a canyon with 4 cord, and tried to imagine what the wall temperature was in her cabin, what the canyon was doing at -22, whether the hypothesis had held. In February, he rode to find out. He crouched through the passage into the granite pocket she had excavated beside the cabin, which she had told him about while the coffee was brewing. The second thermal space she had found by accident in November, when she was looking for a place to store the root vegetables away from the cabin's temperature fluctuations. The granite pocket was not intended as a thermal space. It was intended as storage. But it was 54 degrees in November and 52 degrees in February, the deep rock temperature of the Colorado granite, and she had moved her root vegetables in and found them perfectly preserved in February, and had then thought about what else could be preserved in a 52-degree room. She had moved her seed stock in. She had moved her preserved foods in. She had moved the books that she did not need daily, because books liked a stable temperature, and the granite pocket was the most stable temperature on the claim. She had not moved herself in because the cabin was warmer than the pocket at 63 degrees versus 52, and she preferred 63. But the pocket was there, behind the cabin, through the passage she had cut in November with the cold chisel and the 3-pound hammer, the rock yielding slowly to the insistence of an instrument, and a woman who had spent the previous November learning that the rock had things to offer if you were patient enough to ask it correctly. Aldous Fenn pressed his hand to the granite pocket wall, and then pressed his hand to the cabin's north wall, and felt the difference. 52 in the pocket, 63 in the cabin. The cabin's fire and the canyon's sun had put 11 degrees of warmth into the north wall beyond what the deep earth provided. He said, "How much wood have you burned?" She said, 2.5 cord. He was quiet. She said, "Since October, 2.5 cord. I have 1.5 remaining." He said, "It's February." She said, "Yes." He said, 1.5 cord will last you to April." She said, "Past April. May, if the spring is late." He said nothing for a long time. He was a land agent, and he had been in the territory for 3 years, and he had watched people burn through their wood supplies and leave in February, and he had watched people make it with nothing to spare, and he had never watched someone sit in a granite canyon in February with a season and a half of wood remaining from a 4-cord start. He said, "I charged you $40. She said, "Yes." He said, "The canyon claim is worth more than $40. She said, "It is worth whatever you can charge for it." She looked at him. "You can charge more because of what I have done here. Or you can tell people what I found, and they can decide for themselves what it is worth." He said, "Those are different outcomes." She said, "Yes." She waited. He was quiet for a moment. He was a precise man, and he was being precise about something. He said, "I sold you land I had not fully assessed." She said, "You sold me what you had." He said, "I could have told you to wait, that a better claim would come available." She said, "I didn't want a better claim by your assessment. I wanted this canyon." He said, "You knew what it was before I did." She said, "I suspected what it was." She paused. "I spent 30 years being a teacher in Denmark. I teach by hypothesis. I had a hypothesis about the granite, and I needed a test." He said, "And Colorado was the test." She said, "And this canyon was the test." She looked at the north wall, the granite face that had absorbed 2 years of August sun and 7 months of cabin fires, and was giving it back to her in February at 63 degrees. She said, "The hypothesis was correct." He looked at the wall. He said, "What does a correct hypothesis produce?" She said, "Knowledge." She paused. "And warmth. In this case, both." He said, "I want to understand this well enough to advise people. The buyers who come to me in the spring. There are always people looking for claims in the canyon country. I have been telling them to look for bottomland." She said, "Bottomland is not wrong. Bottomland is good. But it does not hold warmth." She stood and went to the south window and looked at the canyon, the south granite face pale in the February light, the shadows moving as the sun passed its zenith. She said, "The granite canyon country has a different logic than the bottomland. The terrain that looks inhospitable is sometimes the terrain that is most hospitable if you understand what it offers." She paused. The canyon that everyone passes by because it is narrow and dark and rocky is the canyon that is warm in February and sheltered from the wind and 2 days from spring before the bottomland claims are. He said, 2 days from spring. She said, the canyon floor warms earlier. The rock faces absorb the March sun, and the temperature in the canyon rises before the open land does. The bottomland settlers will still be burning wood in March when the canyon is already giving back what the winter put in. He said, you have been here since August. She said, since August. He said, alone. She said, alone. He said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the books on the shelf, the 6 books she had brought from Denmark, the 2 she had traded for at the settlement in September, the one Anders Lund had lent her in December that she had not yet returned. He said, the books. She said, I brought them from Denmark. He said, you brought books to Colorado. She said, I brought what was mine. He said, you brought what was yours to a canyon claim that no one else wanted. She said, yes. He said, and you built what you understood from 30 years of thinking about a barn. She said, yes. She looked at him. It took 30 years because I did not have a canyon. He was quiet. Then he said, I want to send people to you in the spring, people who are looking at the canyon country and who would benefit from understanding what you have found. She said, send them. I will show them what I built, and I will explain what the rock does, and they can decide for themselves what to do with it. He said, you would do this without charge. She said, the first time. After that I will charge what a teacher charges, which is not much, but is something. He said, what does a teacher charge? She said, in Denmark we charge time. If you learned something, you owed time teaching someone else. She paused. Here I will charge labor. If someone comes and learns the method, they come back in summer and help me dig. There is more to excavate in the back of the canyon that I cannot do alone. He said, you want to go deeper into the rock. She said, the pocket behind the cabin is 20 feet deep. The granite continues for another 40 feet before the composition changes. She looked at the wall. I want to see what is in the next 40 feet. He looked at her. He said, you could extend the pocket into a second room. She said, a second room. Yes. And a passage between the cabin and the pocket wide enough to walk upright, so the cabin and the granite storage are connected without stepping outside. He said, connected. She said, connected, so the warmth can move between them, and the cold cannot come in when I go between. He was quiet. Then he said, that is a different kind of home. She said, yes. She looked at the north wall, and the granite pocket passage, and the south window, and the canyon beyond it. It is a different kind of home. It is the kind that uses what is already here instead of fighting what is already here. He said, you will be here long enough to build it. She said, I will be here as long as the canyon is here. He said nothing. He looked at the north wall, the 63-degree wall that had been there since before anyone had come to this part of Colorado, and that would be there when they were all gone, maintaining its own temperature, offering its warmth to whoever understood how to receive it. He put his hand flat against the wall. He held it there. He said, I will send you 3 families in May. She said, send 4. I have enough canyon for 4. March came the way March came in the high country, not in a rush, not with the dramatic warmth of lower elevations, but with a gradual increase in the angle of the sun that the canyon walls read before the open land did. The south granite face caught the March sun at an angle steeper than February, and the wall temperature climbed first on the south face, warming the canyon air, and then on the north wall of the cabin as the canyon air warmed and the accumulated charge in the north granite began its seasonal restoration. She pressed her palm to the north wall on the 1st of March. 65 degrees, 2 degrees warmer than January's peak. The wall was warming with the season, climbing toward the summer temperature it would hold until October, the deep geological warmth of the Colorado granite that answered to the season's accumulated heat, but did not answer to a single cold day, or a single cold week, or a single cold February. She had used 2 3/4 cord from 4, 1 1/4 cord remaining on the 1st of March in the Colorado high country, with the canyon already warming under the climbing sun, with the granite walls already beginning to give back what the summer would put into them. She wrote this in the notebook she had been keeping since August, the daily record of wall temperatures and fire sizes and wood consumption, the data of an experiment that was also a life. The notebook was in Danish, which was the language she thought in, and the language she had taught in, and the language in which the numbers made the most sense to her. The numbers said what they said. She had come to the canyon with a hypothesis, and the canyon had tested it, and the test had produced knowledge and warmth in equal measure. She closed the notebook. She went to the south window and looked at the canyon, the pale granite faces in the March light, the east wall already touched by the morning sun, warming toward the day's peak. The canyon floor in shadow at the bottom, the cold air draining out the way it always did, the cold seeking the low ground and leaving the thermal layer above it, the canyon managing its own temperature by the physics of air density and rock mass and solar geometry that she had been learning for 8 months. She had been wrong about some things. The cold air drainage through the canyon floor was stronger than she had anticipated, requiring her to keep the door well sealed at the base. The south window, at the size she had specified, admitted more winter wind than she had calculated on particularly windy days, requiring the interior baffle she had built in November. The granite pocket's 52 degrees was colder than she had hoped for seed storage, and she had needed to move the seeds to a higher shelf where the air was warmer. She had been wrong about some things, and she had learned from being wrong, and she had adjusted, and the adjustments had worked, and the winter was ending with 1 1/4 cord of wood remaining and 65 degrees on the north wall. In teaching, this was called a successful experiment. In frontier building, this was called surviving the winter and having something to spare. She thought they were the same thing. Aldous Fenn sent her 4 families in May, as he had promised. He sent them with a note that said, "She will explain the method." He had told them enough to make them curious, and not enough to make them think they understood before they arrived. They arrived on 3 different days in May. The families who had bought canyon claims on Fenn's new assessments, which now included the category he had added to his ledger in December, granite proximity and orientation. They came and looked at the cabin and the granite pocket and the connection between them that she had cut in the early spring with the help of Anders Lund's son, Petter, who had been the first of the winter's 4 students in canyon thermal construction. Petter had pressed his hand against the north wall in November and gone home, and moved his own cabin 6 feet east to back it against the granite outcrop on his claim's south side, a modification that had cost him 2 weeks of work in the cold, and that had, by his own account to her in February, cut his daily wood consumption by 1/3, 1/3 less wood for the same cabin warmth, because the rock was there, and he had moved toward it instead of ignoring it. She showed the 4 families what she had built, and she explained what she had found, and she answered their questions with the patience of a schoolteacher who had spent 30 years explaining things to people who did not yet understand them, and who knew that not understanding was not the same as unwilling, and that the willing student who did not yet understand was the best student there was. She told them about the south-facing canyon principle. She told them about the morning sun on the east face and the afternoon sun on the west face, and the reflected warmth from the south face into the cabin windows. She told them about the thermal mass charging cycle, the summer fires and the winter holds, the morning reading of the wall temperature as the account book of the stone's thermal reserves. She told them about her father's barn and the 30 years of thinking about it. She told them The rock does not offer warmth to people who walk past it. It offers warmth to people who build toward it, who press their hand against it and listen to what the temperature says, who understand that the mountain is already doing something and that the best thing a builder can do is get out of the mountain's way and let it do the thing it has always done. One of the four families, a German couple named Brenner who had come to Colorado from Wisconsin with a frame cabin's worth of lumber already milled and waiting, looked at each other when she said this, and then looked at her and said, "We have the lumber." She said, "I know." They said, "We bought a canyon claim with a granite face on the north side of the draw." She said, "I know which one." She had walked every canyon in the accessible territory since August, reading the walls. I helped Fenn develop the assessment criteria. They said, "Can you come look at it before we build?" She said, "Yes." She went with them the following day and stood in their canyon and looked at the north granite face, which was better than hers, more continuous and deeper into the hill, with a natural pocket behind the main face that would require only modest excavation to be usable. She told them where to put the cabin and how to orient the south face, and where the pocket passage should go, and what the south wall should be, and how large the windows should be, and why. She did not tell them how to build it. They had the lumber and the knowledge of frame construction. She told them what to build toward and why, and then she stood back and let them build. By the end of the summer of 1863, there were 6 canyon cabins in the accessible territory that backed against granite faces with south-facing windows and sod roofs and interior pocket passages. Aldous Fenn had sold 5 of the 6 claims. The 6th was hers. She was the first person in the territory to have a second room of connected interior space entirely within the granite, the room she had excavated through the winter with Petter Lund's help, and the cold chisel and the 3-pound hammer that had been her father's. The second room was 20 feet by 12, with an arched ceiling of natural granite and a temperature of 54 degrees in November and 58 degrees by February, charged by the passage connection to the cabin and by the solar cycle of the canyon walls above. She put her books in the second room, all of them. The shelf she built against the inside granite face ran 12 feet and held every book she had and would hold more when she had more. She stood in the second room in the autumn of 1863 and looked at her books on the granite shelf and felt the warmth of the stone around her and thought about Denmark, which she did not miss in the way she had expected to miss it. She missed the sea smell and the flat Jutland light and the particular quality of a Danish morning in September. She did not miss the smallness of the position she had held there, or the way the town had looked at a schoolteacher without a husband and decided she was a problem to be managed. She had been a problem to be managed in Denmark. She was a hypothesis in Colorado. The hypothesis had proven correct, and she was warm in February, and the rock held what she gave it, and she had more canyon to excavate. She pressed her palm to the granite shelf. 61 degrees. The books were warm. The mountain was warm. The winter was coming, and she had 5 cords stacked in the narrow space between the east wall and the east canyon face. Under the pole roof that had been the first structure she built in this canyon, the cover for the wood that preceded the cover for herself. 5 cord, from a start of 4 the previous year. She had cut more this year because she had learned she could charge the rock higher than she had initially achieved, that with a more sustained early winter fire strategy, she could push the north wall to 65 in October and hold it there through January, which reduced the daily fire requirement and stretched the wood supply further than the previous year's 4 cord had stretched. She was refining the hypothesis. This was what you did with a correct hypothesis. You did not stop because it had proven correct. You kept asking it questions. You pushed it further into the territory where you did not yet know what was true. Aldous Fenn came to see her in September of 1863, before the cold came down, because by then he came in September instead of February. He came on a professional visit, and he came as something closer to a colleague, which was a thing that had evolved over the 18 months since May of 1862, without either of them precisely deciding it should. He looked at the second room and the 12 feet of bookshelf and pressed his hand to the granite wall and said, 61. She said, in September, yes. It will be 65 by November if the early fires go as I expect. He said, you expect them to go better than last year. She said, I understand the rock better than I did last year. The charging cycle has a rhythm I did not know in the first year. There are 3 weeks in October when the granite is particularly receptive, when the fire's heat goes in faster than usual, and the wall comes up 2 degrees in a week instead of 1. I am building larger fires in those 3 weeks this year. He said, how do you know which 3 weeks? She said, I watch the temperature curve, each morning reading against the previous morning. When the rate of change slows, the window is passing. He said, you are managing a heat budget. She said, yes. He said, like a banker managing a deposit account. She said, exactly like that. She paused. The stone is the account. The fire is the deposit. The winter is the withdrawal. The goal is to arrive at April with more in the account than you had when October started. He said, had more in the account in April than October. She said, yes. This year I expect to achieve that. He said, you've been thinking about this all summer. She said, I'm a teacher. Thinking about the problem is what I do between the tests. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at the books on the granite shelf, the Danish spines, the German mathematical text she had been working through in the evenings, the English surveying manual she had borrowed from the settlement office and not returned. He said, can I ask you something that is not about granite? She said, yes. He said, you have been here alone for 16 months. She said, yes. He said, are you? He stopped. He said, is this what you wanted? She looked at him. He was a precise man, and he was not being precise right now, which was unusual. She said, is this what I wanted, the canyon and the rock and the experiment? He said, yes. Or is there something else you wanted that you have not said? She looked at the granite wall and the books and the lamp and the warm room that was inside the mountain. She said, I wanted to be warm and to be useful and to be not small. She paused. I have all 3. He was quiet. She said, you are asking if I am lonely. He said, yes. She said, yes. She looked at him. But there is a difference between lonely and alone. I am alone, and I prefer alone to most of the alternatives. The lonely part is the part where there is no one to tell about the 3-degree gain in February. The lonely part is the morning reading with no one to give the number to. He said, 63. She said, yes. That was February's number. He said, 65 will be this October's number. She said, that is the projection. He said, I would like to receive the numbers if you want to give them. She looked at him for a long moment. He was a precise man, and he had just said something imprecise on purpose, which was the way precise people said things they meant when the precise language was not adequate to the meaning. She said, come in October. I'll have the first week's readings by then. He said, I'll come in October. He came in October, and she gave him the numbers, and they looked at the north wall together, the 64-degree wall climbing towards 65 as the October fires charged the rock. And outside the canyon, the Colorado autumn was putting its cold on the high country, and the granite walls of the canyon were reading the sun and the season and doing what they had always done and would always do, holding what they were given and giving back what was asked of them. The wall held. The winter came. The rock was warm,